Good evening, Forest community members, and welcome to our Forest Focus webinar this evening. As always, we're not expecting any technical difficulties, but please do bear with us if we encounter any problems. If you could be kind enough to complete our feedback survey, so we're always improving what we do, that would be great, and that will be displayed at the end for you in the form of a QR code. Please do join us on Tuesday the 6th of February for our next webinar, which will be focused on diversity and inclusivity. Why does it matter for your child? And that will be delivered in our EDI week. And this year's theme is celebrating difference. So we're hugely excited for that. I will be introducing our guest speaker tonight, who will be discussing vaping and snus. And education in terms of RSHE, relationship sexual health education, especially regarding harmful substances, particularly vaping, will be covered in the RSE curriculum for all key stages at some point. If you do wish for further information of the content of this and when it will be delivered, particularly related to your child and section and key stage, please do contact Miss Arthur as Head of Department for RSHE. So our speaker this evening, Dr. Maggie, is the Director of Medical Provision at Forest School. So we're very, very lucky to have her join us, but has previously worked as an NHS doctor in various internal medical fields, as well as surgical fields. Dr. Maggie has completed her foundation training in Colchester Hospital, and she will be combining her medical knowledge with the observations she has made working in the school setting, collating information from variable sources to give advice on how to manage cases of vaping and snoozes under the age of 18. We're incredibly lucky to have Dr. Maggie as part of our medical team at Forest, but she works very closely, obviously, with the safeguarding team, with Mr. Kane and the deputy DSLs, and as well as myself with pastoral. So without further ado, I'm going to bring on Dr. Maggie.
Hello, thank you very much, Ms. Milton. And thank you to all of those who have joined us. And if you're watching this on YouTube, not live, thank you for taking the time to do so. So this presentation is going to be about vapes and snus. I think this is an incredibly important topic and one that parents should, talk to their children about. It is on the rise. So let's start with vapes, and let's first establish what vapes or e-cigarettes are. So they come in various forms depending on which generation they are from. The most common ones are vape pods and mods, and the first e-cigarette was actually invented in 2003. So it's been a long time. It's been 2 decades that they've been around, but they've been getting increasingly popular in recent years. So this year, it's estimated that 4.3 million British people vape, which is up from 800,000 just a decade ago. So vapes work by vaporizing liquid that contains 4 ingredients: nicotine, 2 dilutants, and flavorings. The vapor is inhaled by the user. So vapes were created as an alternative to tobacco smoking and have shown to be a really great and effective stop smoking aid, especially compared to nicotine patches or nicotine gums. So when used by the correct demographic, vapes can actually be life-changing and life-prolonging. As we know, cigarettes are one of the leading causes of preventable deaths worldwide. They release thousands of chemicals, 70 of which are known carcinogens and are toxic not only to the user, but also to the people who are exposed to the secondhand smoke. And those who switch from smoking to vaping have significantly reduced exposure to the toxins associated with risks of cancer, lung disease, heart disease, and stroke. And it also protects the users, the people around the user, because they're not inhaling that toxic smoke. So the most important thing to know is that vapes are made for people who already have a nicotine addiction. Vapes are not risk-free. They can cause side effects such as throat and mouth irritation, headache, cough, and nausea, especially in the long term. And of course, because, they've been around for 2 decades, but they're only on the rise recently. So it's difficult to say what the long-term effects may be. And now snus. So this is a slightly newer one that we're seeing. It's very popular in Scandinavian countries, but it's slowly making its way to the UK. It contains ground tobacco, salt, and flavorings, and it's pre-packaged in small sachets, a bit like mini tea bags, but it can also come in like a loose powder form. The nicotine content varies between brands, and most of it is produced in Sweden. It is pasteurized, not fermented, meaning that it inhibits the growth of bacteria, which form tobacco-specific carcinogens. And it doesn't sort of provide any or present with any respiratory risks, as it is placed under the lip and sort of between the lip and gum, and it releases the nicotine into the saliva. Snus is not associated with any cancers. There have been some reports of it being associated with pancreatic cancer, although the research is fairly weak and unsupported. But the general consensus is that there are no known sort of disease risks involved. But as with vaping, it can be a good alternative to stopping traditional tobacco smoking. However, selling snus is actually illegal in the UK. So if we look a little bit into the statistics, obviously since snus is illegal, we don't really have official statistics, but it is on the rise. We're seeing it more and more. It's seen in schools, so it's definitely something that we have to be wary of. So if we look at this graph, we can see that the numbers aren't huge. 11.6% might not seem that high, but we do have to take into account that there will probably be some underreporting, that not all under 18s will be forthcoming and want to sort of expose themselves and say that they vape. But it is generally, the trend is going up. So 11.6%, and that's for trying vaping once or twice. So a bit more of a, just seeing what it is, trying it out. Regular use is a lot lower. It's about 3.7. Again, we have to take into account potential underreporting. And then occasional use is quite similar at 3.9%. And then this is ever use of cigarettes, of e-cigarettes by age. So we see that most, the highest number is 38%. Those are 18-year-olds using e-cigarettes regularly. And then 16 to 17 is about 34%, so not too far off. But 11 to 15 is 15%, which is still a fairly significant number. And then here are various reasons why people under 18 decide to try a vape. And so the orange is the people who've never tried tobacco products, it's cigarettes, and the black is people who have had or been exposed to smoking cigarettes. So largely, you'll see, just to give it a try. Obviously, young people are curious. They want to know, they see other people do it, they want to give it a try. But we will sort of go into why even once is just not worth it, or it's not really worth even experimenting or trying, because it can lead to sort of a snowball effect. But that's generally the reason. They want to feel like they fit in, their peers do it, they might enjoy the experience. Those are the most common reasons as to why people vape under 18. And then this is also quite an important one. So this is where they are getting these vapes from. So as I mentioned, it is legal for under 18s to vape or to even buy vapes, to use vapes. But the most common ways of obtaining a vape for under 18s is either buying them from a shop or being given them by someone else. Could be friends or, just whoever they manage to convince to get them a vape. But those are the ones we'll focus on a little bit later. So going back to the law, the law is very clear on the use of vapes for under 18s. It is illegal for anyone under 18 to purchase or use vaping products. The Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, or MHRA, is responsible for implementing a number of provisions to ensure that minimum standards for safety and quality of vapes are met. So vape cartridges must not contain more than 2 millilitres of e-liquid and contain no more than 20 milligrams per milliliter of nicotine. All vapes must be notified and published by the MHRA before they can be legally sold to over 18s. But given that the majority of adolescents who vape either buy the vapes themselves illegally or get them from someone else, the chances of acquiring illegal and potentially dangerous vapes increases. So if they are bought, the credibility of the shop must be questioned. Why are they not checking IDs? If they're not implementing strict ID checks, can we trust that the vapes that they are selling are actually MRHA legal? And then on the other hand, if under 18s are acquiring them from others, it is difficult to trace where those vapes came from, if they're MHRA legal. And also the person supplying these vapes is choosing to break the law, and that needs to be considered. Can that person actually be trusted? So in May of last year, 2023, the BBC actually reported an illegal vapes that had been confiscated from school pupils at Baxter College in Kidderminster. There were 18 vapes in total, and they found when they were tested that they contained twice the daily safe amount of lead and 9 times the safe amount of nickel. So lead is a neurotoxin and it impairs brain development, and nickel is an allergen, it's a metal. Generally, metal particles in the bloodstream can cause blood clotting, can exacerbate any cardiovascular disease. And these are illegal vapes, and these are just pupils who, thought, oh, let's give it a go. I just, want to give it a try. But actually what they were smoking was dangerous and full of chemicals that shouldn't be there. And Snus, as mentioned, illegal. So, but the usage is actually permissible for over 18s, of course, not under 18s. So, yes. So we'll talk a little bit now about the effects of nicotine on brain development. So since the main sort of product that is dangerous in vapes and, well, legal vapes, and snus is the nicotine, that's what this session will really focus on. I think there's a lot of focus with cigarettes about the thousands of chemicals, which absolutely, the tar, the horrible stuff that they put in it, that is extremely dangerous. But because that sort of is so significant, it overshadows the effects of nicotine. But because vapes don't really contain many chemicals when they're legal, only 4 things are in them, and snus is just really tobacco. I want to focus on the nicotine. So the effects of nicotine on human brain development cannot be studied directly for obvious ethical reasons. We're not going to be giving children nicotine or vapes and then testing them. But countless studies have been performed on rats because our brain chemistry is actually very similar. So we can observe how highly addictive nicotine is. It is the reason why 3 in every 4 people who start smoking or vaping as teenagers continue into adulthood. Nicotine mediates its effects via receptors called nicotinic cholinergic receptors. They are very widely distributed throughout the brain. They respond to a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, but nicotine is an agonist, which means it sort of mimics acetylcholine, the transmitter, and it means that it can bind to these receptors and sort of activate them. So they are expressed very early in brain development and play a critical role in developmental stages, from cognition to behavior and to learning to emotions. So in certain parts of the brain, these receptors are more sensitive to the effects of nicotine, and many long-term neurochemical and morphological changes have been linked to nicotine use in adolescent years. Also, during brain development, connections between some neurons, so these are known as synapses, grow stronger, while others are removed or pruned, a bit like branches, tree branches, by immune cells, and they're effectively sort of like the cleaners of the brain. They keep everything in order, and this process should create a more efficient adult brain. But using nicotine during this time appears to change the way these immune cells sort of prune the synapses, and therefore the way the brain reorganizes itself in preparation for adulthood is altered. Most notably, this has been observed in 2 areas of the brain. I mean, it's been seen in many areas of the brain, but I want to focus on 2 in particular. One is called the nucleus accumbens and the basolateral amygdala. Amygdala is probably one that people would have heard of a bit more. So the nucleus accumbens plays a significant role in cognitive processing of emotion, aversion, and reward, such as positive reinforcement. And then the basolateral amygdala mediates specific Pavlovian instrumental transfer, so also known as classical conditioning, whereby a conditioned stimulus is associated with a rewarding or an aversive stimuli, Pavlov's dog, that kind of thing. And it's also responsible for fear and pain memory. So we can now start thinking, okay, we're seeing these changes with nicotine when they bind to these receptors, and especially in these parts of the brain that are involved in such important processes, we can start recognizing that our brains are quite sensitive and susceptible to change because of it. So let's talk about nicotine and the risks. So before I discuss the behavioral and cognitive changes that occur as a result of nicotine exposure, I'd just like to stress that the mechanism is extremely complex. I've tried to simplify the information as much as possible, but I obviously don't want to make it seem like there's only one type of process or one neurotransmitter, one receptor that's responsible for these effects. It's a plethora of things that play that go into it, but for the purpose of today's session, I'm just going to try and keep it brief and simple. But I do strongly encourage for those interested to read up on some studies if you'd like to get the full picture. They're quite heavy, but I definitely recommend them. So, because nicotine releases a flood of dopamine, I'm sure we're all aware of the effects of dopamine. It's a neurotransmitter that creates upbeat and happy feelings. People love feeling that surge of dopamine. And this positive sensation, it makes people want to use the nicotine again. But over time, it takes a lot more nicotine to get that same feeling of reward, the same positive feelings. So it sets you up into this cycle of craving, and that leads to addiction. And very quickly, the brain's reward system becomes altered, and it's sort of never the same. So research has shown that in young rats, the equivalent to human teenagers were more sensitive to nicotine than adult rats. And adolescents have an overreactive reward response and improved task performance when earning rewards, which means that they are more likely to engage in these behaviors that sort of result in this immediate gratification. So they're sort of, looking for that dopamine rush. And young rats had a higher level of nicotine self-administration than adult rats. They had decreased sensitivity to the aversive effects of nicotine and less prominent withdrawal following chronic nicotine exposure. So you've got these increased positive and decreased negative short-term effects of nicotine during adolescence. And that highlights the possibility that teenagers are particularly vulnerable to sort of developing that dependency to nicotine and then continuing to use vapes and snus. And in fact, in the UK, most adult smokers had their first cigarette or were already addicted to nicotine by the age of 18. And 90% of lifetime smoking is initiated between the ages of 10 and 20 years of age. So we are seeing that relationship between starting at a very early age and continuing that habit over the years and into adulthood. And links have also been found between adolescent nicotine use and other addictions. So activation of nicotinic cholinergic receptors through a nicotine-induced dopamine release. So lots of dopamine coming out because of the activation of these receptors. It can alter the expression and function of other receptors involved in drug use. Of course, there's millions of receptors. We won't go into them, but not all drugs obviously work in the same way or activate the same receptors, but there is that link that nicotine can sort of adjust or heighten the response of other drugs. And in a study, they found that early adolescent rats exposed to intravenous, so via vein, nicotine levels equivalent to 1 or 2 cigarettes per day for 4 days. So this is quite a low dose. I mean, there's people who smoke a pack a day. That's 20 cigarettes. So one or two, fairly low dose, and over a fairly short time, only 4 days. And they actually self-administered a greater amount of cocaine, methamphetamines, alcohol, compared to the adolescent rats that were never exposed to nicotine, or unexposed adult rats. So it didn't really matter that they were adolescent or adult. It mattered that they had nicotine at such an early age. And a study in the US, so a lot of this research is also done in the US, revealed that the rate of cocaine dependence was actually the highest among cocaine users who had initiated cocaine but started smoking cigarettes first. So that was at 20.2%. And the rate of dependence to cocaine was much lower amongst those who hadn't initiated smoking before. That was about 6.3%. So there is that gap there. And more notably, alcohol. Alcohol and nicotine products are more frequently co-abused than consumed separately. A survey in the US of high school seniors, these about 17, 18-year-olds, revealed that 88% of smokers were drinkers, while 55% of non-smokers were drinkers. So the adolescent susceptibility to co-use of nicotine and alcohol is also observed in rodents. So as concurrent self-administration of both drugs in adolescent was quite high in the rats, but not amongst the adult rats. So basically exposure to the nicotine made the rats self-administer the alcohol more, but in the population of adult rats that hadn't been exposed to nicotine, the self-administration of alcohol was a lot lower. So these findings sort of collectively indicate that nicotine exposure during adolescence enhances alcohol consumption more than if that same exposure occurs later in life. So the nicotine exposure. And moving on, there is a very clear relationship, very strong relationship between nicotine dependence and neuropsychiatric disorders. But in terms of the potential relations between smoking and mood and anxiety disorders, causality may run in multiple directions. So, for example, individuals with higher trait anxiety levels are more likely to report smoking behaviors, suggesting that nicotine dependence may serve as a self-medication strategy to mitigate sort of the pre-existing anxiety symptoms rather than causing it. But alternatively, anxiety-related symptoms may develop due to underlying genetic factors that make the individual more susceptible to nicotine, independently of the effects of nicotine itself on the developing brain. It's sort of like the chicken and the egg, what came first? But that leads us to the question, so does exposure to nicotine during these critical periods of adolescent brain development trigger a pathophysiological process towards the development of mood and anxiety disorders? It's not very clear, but there is sort of enough evidence pointing to a potential cause and effect relationship that just does not warrant the use of nicotine in adolescent years. So in rat studies, behaviorally, rats treated with chronic nicotine during adolescence displayed a variety of depressive and anxiety-like states when they were tested in early adulthood. They noticed, obviously you can't ask a rat, are you depressed? But you can make inferences. So they noticed that they spent a lot less time in bright environments, and they didn't really want to be in the center of an open field. So rats generally don't like open spaces, but the rats treated with the nicotine were a lot more afraid of open spaces. They wouldn't go in the middle. They've noticed some deficits in social cognition, memory. There's increased immobility in the forced swim test. So they sort of freeze a lot more rather than just sort of push through that fear. And they actually had a decreased sucrose preference. So rats love the sugary taste and in the ones that were treated with the nicotine, that was a lot lower. So generally, rats showed greater stress response and a lack of interest in positive experiences like the sucrose. And also from a sort of molecular point of view, the researchers found some adaptations, including in the nucleus accumbens that we spoke about earlier. So in adolescent rats treated with nicotine that then persisted into adulthood. So these changes were long lasting. Rather than sort of a short-term molecular change, they noticed that as those rats aged, the changes that were made during that exposure to nicotine actually didn't go away, they persisted. So these biomarkers, these molecular biomarkers, have been associated in humans with mood and anxiety disorders. However, it's also important to know actually that in that study, they found that those molecular changes were completely absent in the adult rat population that wasn't exposed. So these changes that they saw in the nucleus accumbens and the molecular structure were only seen in the adolescent rats exposed to nicotine that were long-lasting, not in the unexposed adult population. And like I said, we can't say for certain that these behaviours are definitely what they are. But again, we make these inferences, and I think combined with what is observable, measurable, and reproducible in these studies, these neurochemical changes, it becomes a lot more compelling that there is a link between the two. And lastly, from the studies, there was another rodent model, which is quite interesting. And they reported that chronic exposure to nicotine in adolescent rats induced significant and enduring cognitive deficits in attentional performance and increments in impulsive control. So these phenotypes are actually absent in adult rats that weren't exposed to nicotine. And this was, again, linked to a change in the neurochemical and functional phenotypes, so what you express. And this was all largely in the prefrontal cortex. So we know that this is an area of the brain which is responsible for adaptive function, emotion regulation, sort of cognitive flexibility, and that area is also affected, seen to be affected in rodents that were exposed to nicotine in their adolescent years. So all of this leads to the question, are vapes worth the risk? No. In adolescence, I mean, there's so many studies, there's so much research done on this, on rodents, where we are seeing these changes, these irreversible changes that even though we can't necessarily directly study this in humans, it seems that there are changes that are made that we don't want to see in our children. We don't want them to become more fearful, more anxious, depressed. I mean, again, any research sort of can be argued that actually cause and effect, and what came first, are people just more susceptible to smoking who have these sorts of problems? But actually, since we've now looked into the molecular, the neurochemical, the morphological changes in these really sensitive parts of the brain, it seems that young people are just very, very susceptible. And it's not the same as starting nicotine in your adult years, sort of maybe after 24 when the brain is fully developed and regressing. But it's just not worth the risk for young people. Like I said, vapes and snus were designed for people who have a nicotine addiction already. They are a much, much safer alternative to cigarettes. But that does not mean that they are risk-free, that people who've never had a nicotine addiction should now be reaching for vapes and for snus to fit in or to give it a go. We've seen in research that actually these low doses for short periods of time are already making an effect that actually is one dose or one sort of time vaping enough to cause some kind of change in a young person's brain, changes that they won't be able to reverse and will last into adulthood. I think the state of the world is quite a stressful one. Things are getting a lot harder for young people, and I don't think that the added sort of stress and anxiety that can be associated long term with nicotine exposure will help in that situation. I think it's also quite similar to using like a comparison to something like insulin. You can have regular medications, medications, not drugs, illicit drugs, but things that people take that are potentially life-saving. And when used by the correct people, so for example, diabetics, when they use insulin, it can be life-saving. But if it's in the hands of someone who doesn't have diabetes, it can actually kill them. It can be horrible. It can cause so much harm. So it's quite similar in this case. When used appropriately by the correct demographic, by people who are trying to get off cigarettes, they are fantastic, but not for young people, not to create a new nicotine addiction. And then what should you do? So as a parent, it is a huge responsibility on your shoulders to sort of relay that information, to have an open dialogue with your children about this. And I think it is important to talk about it openly rather than sort of pretend that it's not happening, especially with the statistics that we've seen where it is on the rise. It is something that needs to be addressed. So how should you talk to them about it? Most importantly, no fear-mongering. I think scaring children is not the way forward. You want to establish the trust with your child, and exaggerating facts or giving them inaccurate information is only going to jeopardize that relationship and that trust. Also, children have access to the internet. They're glued to their phones. They can fact check you. Even on the NHS website, I think there's a website where it's sort of common myths around vapes, and pretty sure number 1 and number 2 is that they are more dangerous than cigarettes. They are not more dangerous than cigarettes, but that does not make them safe for young people. So it's about contextualizing that information and making it relevant to them. There's a big push for the use of vapes. You can see sort of how they're marketed. They're quite appealing to young people. They're very colourful, lots of interesting flavours. So it sort of makes it look like they should be accessible to under 18s, but they're not. They shouldn't be used as that. They should be used as a tool to stop smoking cigarettes. So if you're able to, find a good time. So talk to them when they're not too stressed or anxious. Don't do it during exam time. We've had our mocks now, so hopefully everyone's a bit more relaxed. But just find a suitable time when they're relaxed. They're not going to sort of get flustered or not know how to react and maybe sort of have a negative reaction to you for bringing this topic up. Try to be natural. If you walk past a vape shop or see someone vaping or on the street or on TV, just try to use it as a cue to talk to your child about vapes. Again, snus, you might start seeing that on the streets, people using it. It's quite obvious. People have a little sort of bulge here on their lip. But bring it up. Don't be scared. And ask what your child thinks about vapes and snus. Ask what they know about them. Don't interrupt them when they're talking. Just let them sort of have the stage, talk about it, talk about what they think about it, what they feel. And if you feel comfortable enough, you can ask, have you tried it before? Don't be scared. I won't be upset if you have. I just want to know whether you've tried it. And if they do confess that they have tried it, or you already maybe even know that they've done it, I know it can be easy to be upset, but try not to become reactive. So it can be really upsetting, but know that your child is more likely to open up to you and seek support from you if they feel that they can do so safely. And praise them for sharing that information. And just maybe ask, so you tried the vape or snooze, how did that make you feel? And then try and gently provide some facts. I'm happy to share this information. The slides, you can look it up yourself. There's loads and loads of research done on the effects of brain development, and there's lots of other things that that is sort of more hypothetical, because vapes have not been around for long enough to see the long-term effects, but things that you can sort of maybe expect or just have in the back of your mind that there can be some kind of long-term consequence to them. Make it feel like a discussion and not like a lecture, like I'm doing right now. Try and talk to them back and forward. Listen to them, they listen to you. Explain why they shouldn't vape or snooze. Tell them, why they're good for adults. Again, this is the fear-mongering thing. I think saying, oh gosh, they're worse than cigarettes, you're going to die, the world's going to fall apart, isn't the right attitude to have. It's about being realistic, having realistic expectations as well from your child, to know that, they might experiment, they might try, and that is okay. Obviously, our aim is for them to never do it, but if they've already done it, you can't change the past by being upset. And then once you've shared that information, ask if that makes sense, answer any questions that they might have. If you see they're a bit hesitant, maybe, talk about it again another time, offer some sort of resources for them to read. And you can very much be clear that you are opposed to using nicotine products. So this isn't about gentle parenting and blurring the lines or appearing neutral or nonchalant, but it needs to be communicated carefully, because I think the more you can push a child and sort of don't do this, do that, sometimes the more they can rebel. And if they confess, for example, that they do feel that pressure from their peers to vape or to snooze, teach them ways that they can say no, thank you, confidently. If they use it to relieve stress, try and find an alternative to help them relax. When they feel like they are under a lot of pressure, what is a safer, better way for them to sort of decompress rather than using a vape which contains nicotine. And help and support them rather than shame them. We know how strong the reward system is in a child's brain. Use that to your advantage. Praise them, encourage them, be open with them. And if you do vape yourself, try not to sort of do it in front of your children, but if they already know about it, use it correctly. So try and taper your nicotine dose until you can quit altogether. They're not made to be used forever or long term, sort of like cigarettes were in the past. It's a temporary measure to sort of quit that addiction, and then eventually reach such a low dose that you can just quit it altogether. Be that positive role model for your child, and make it a positive experience rather than a stressful one. So having that openness, keep having those discussions. But yeah, I hope that was clear. I know it is quite a heavy topic, and it is very science-based. There's a lot of research, there's a lot of receptors and parts of the brain, and it can get a bit complicated. But the sort of conclusion or the general consensus is nicotine does affect brain development. Nicotine as an adult, once the brain has developed, is a completely different picture. Our brains have already sort of developed to 100%, but in that critical period for young people, when they are still growing and developing, and those neurons are connecting, or the immune cells are trying to sort of cut the right connections and the right neurons, it's just not worth getting into an addiction. I think people are a lot more aware of cigarettes. Cigarettes use is on the decline, but let's not replace that with vaping. Today, actually, I think I saw the Rishi Sunak, our favourite man, is kind coming up with actually a good idea for once, where there's going to be a ban on using vapes. So people born after, I think it was 2009, will no longer be able to buy vapes in the future. So it is, this isn't something that is going to last forever, I hope. But in that interim where it is on the rise, let's try and be responsible. Let's help these young people. Let's try and prevent it from starting. But if it's already started, also not to scare children that, oh my gosh, your brain's never going to be the same, but just not continuing it, because the longer the exposure is, the bigger the changes are, and then the harder it can be for them to sort of adapt to scary situations. Adulthood is scary. Let's not make it scarier for them. So thank you very much for your attention. I've tried to keep it brief. I hope I didn't go too fast or ramble, but please do leave any feedback or any questions, and I'm happy to provide sources where you can read a little bit more about sort of where I collated this information from if you're interested. So thank you very much.